Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining our global SciComm meetup. My name is John Chase. We have two absolutely fantastic speakers. Now, in particular, they're talking about a particular approach. They'll share more with you about how to view science communication in a different way. And why it's relevant to global SciComm is that it literally is talking about how you embed and respect and review and pay attention to the local conditions when you're considering science communication. So I'm not going to say anything more. I'm going to let them take over. So I'd love to introduce to you Marianne Achiam and Sabrina Vitting-Syrup, both from Copenhagen in Denmark, to present their ideas about terroir. Not terror, terroir. And I'll hand over to you guys. Thank you so much.
Lovely. Thank you so much, John, for inviting us to do this. This is a really wonderful setting and a wonderful group of people. So welcome, everyone. My name is Marianne, and I'm here with Sabrina, and we have divided this talk up a little bit between us. So I'll start by taking you through some of the background for our idea here of terroir and science communication. And then Sabrina will take over and take you through some exercises where you can think about how you might be able to use it in your own practice. So that's the plan. I'm going to start sharing my slides now. So let's just see here. I think that should be, is that visible?
Yep.
Yes, thumbs up. Perfect. Great stuff. Thanks. Okay, so the title of the talk is SciComm Reimagined, and that reimagining is about thinking about how terroir can be used as a metaphor to prioritize, as John said, the local rather than the global, the particular rather than the general. So let's get started with that. And I will just say first that the paper that John mentioned, I think he also included it in the invitation to this talk. This is the paper that we're referring to. It's open access, and you can access it by using that QR code in front of you right now. But you can see the research group that worked on this paper together is myself and Sabrina, but also Martin, Jacob, and Louise. So it's the group of us who came up with this idea. And so the impetus for this idea was really the massive problems that we face in the world right now. This is an image of a forest fire from Caracas, but of course there are many, many massive problems and challenges facing us right now. And so in our group, we wanted to kind of heed this call from Geo Takach. He talks about how in this age, with the escalating perils that we face and the consequent inequality that follows with that, it's really important for scholars and practitioners who work on the environment to do more, right? We can't just keep describing and theorizing about what the Anthropocene might mean. We need to actually get off our rear ends and do something, right? So this was really our attempt to think a little bit more about what might be possible to do. And once we started thinking about the Anthropocene and the problems we face, we quite quickly come up against this notion of modernity. So that's kind of the starting point, I think, for this talk today. And by modernity, I refer to the different norms, discourses, attitudes, practices, basically ways of thinking and doing that characterize the way Western societies act, right? And what do I mean by that? I'll give you some examples in the following. But basically, modernity describes a period of time that more or less started with the Enlightenment period in the 18th century and continues to be shaped by the thoughts that appeared in that period. And so one very important idea that came from that period, of course, was the scientific breakthrough or the scientific revolution. And so at this point in time, science became really the rational, the all-governing way of thinking about the world. And we saw in this period that scientific disciplines emerged all over the West, or Europe, maybe I should say. Scientific discipline kind of subdivided the world into well-defined objects, right? So zoology took some objects, botany took other objects, geology took other objects and made them kind of their own, right? And these scientific disciplines had quite clear boundaries between them, right? So this was a way to subdivide the world. And what happened was that the objects that each of those disciplines studied became quite well defined, right? And the interactions between those objects became so well defined and described that they almost became reduced to these simple cause-effect relationships. So this was a quite mechanistic way of looking at the world and the objects of the world. Um, and in particular, the natural sciences really contributed to this view of nature in a quite divided way. So humans were seen as quite distinct from nature, and nature was seen as something else and something that could be very strongly subdivided and understood and even controlled, right? So it's also it's a mechanistic and it's a very technical way of looking at the world. So modernity was also shaped by the Industrial Revolution, which started in the 1800s and had several waves that rolled over the Western world. The Industrial Revolution had a series of great advancements that tended to free humans, it seemed, from nature and its limitations, right? So think about using fossil fuels. We can burn fossil fuels in minutes, but the natural processes that create fossil fuels take millennia, right? Those are processes of photosynthesis of plants and animals growing, living and dying and becoming mineralized to become fossil fuels, right? So those are processes that take millions of years, right? And yet we can pump up fossil fuels and burn through that energy stored there in a matter of minutes. So this was a way that we became emancipated, you might say, from nature and from natural limitations. And because the Industrial Revolution was so powerful and we kept seeing these great advances, it almost became a promise to humanity that we would have endless progress, endless development. This could just keep going. And so these logics became quite important, right? Logics of capitalism, consumerism, and the free market, they became quite dominant in Western societies at this point in time. And then finally, this last idea of the Homo economicus, which was the way that science and rationality thought about humans. We became seen as rational beings making well-considered and informed decisions, decisions based on careful considerations of pros and cons, and decisions that were quite consistent, right? So if we decided on something, we kind of stuck with that decision. We were considered to be very, very rational. And what's really interesting about this is that these ideas, these modernist ideas, continue to kind of dominate the way that we think about the world, even though these ways of thinking have also kind of created the problems that we face right now, right? So instead of becoming the masters and possessors of nature, as these discourses kind of promised us we would become, we're actually being hit by the problems that point of view has created in a kind of boomerang, right? So we're becoming more and more entangled in these feedback loops of the Earth system. It's coming back to hit us in the head now, right? And so even though we in the West remain quite captivated or embedded in this kind of reductionist, modernist worldview, even though that is what has created the problems we're facing right now, we remain captivated by it because we are constantly being confronted with its logic in the mass media, education systems, and other kinds of institutions. So we are, and the way we think about the world, we are kind of a part of this problem, right? And almost to the extent that we can't even see it ourselves because we're so embroiled in it. So that, in a sense, was what we wanted to think about in the research group and try to do something about through science communication, right? So what does this mean for the practice and the research of science communication? And science communication is equally embroiled in modernity, right? It's part of the problem as well, at least the way that we often think about it. So this is returning to this source here, Gio Takach, who talks about how science communication and environmental communication, to the extent that it deals with scientific issues such as global warming and so on, it is so kind of aligned with the natural sciences that it kind of takes on scientific research methods, right? It adopts this quite positivist quantitative orientation that we associate with science, and also with these kind of modernist ways of thinking about the world, right? So, like I said before, science communication is kind of part of the problem here, right? Or at least the way that we traditionally think about it. And so this is one example. So this is from a report from 2020, an article, sorry, from 2020, where Eric Jensen and Alexander Gerber talk about how science communication can be thought of as evidence-based. So they're really kind of invoking scientific methodology here, right? And they say it's quite systematically about combining professional expertise and skills, best available evidence. So this word evidence from science, right? Systematic research underpinned by established theory. So this is a very scientific way of looking at science communication, a very technical way perhaps of looking at science communication. And another similar example here is this example from Kay in 2017, who talks about the science of science communication, right? So this really is kind of a field of study to them. So the science of science communication is an empirical approach. It relies on evidence that is transparent, replicable, right? So all the kind of good scientific words here, theory-driven, generalizable. It is derived by the scientific method. So we have this very sort of strong framing of science communication as something that is sort of predictable, controllable, subdividable, and knowable somehow, right? And this was, I think, the perception of science communication that we rebelled a little bit against in our research group, because it seems so reminiscent of these modernist thoughts that we were kind of protesting a little bit against, right? And so we wanted to shift the focus, and here I use a table from Patricia Levy. We wanted to shift the focus from this slightly mechanistic, technical way of looking at science communication in terms of numbers, data that could be discovered and measured, tabulating and being value neutral. We wanted to move much more into a qualitative and even arts-based paradigm with our science communication, thinking about maybe making meaning or evoking senses using stories, images, sounds, and scenes, et cetera, creating resonance rather than generalizability, because this was something that appealed much more to the way that we thought about science communication in the group. This is not completely unique. Davies and Horst here in 2016 talk about science communication as something that is not linear, something that cannot be modeled in a diagram with arrows, right? They say it's a jungle full of colors and smells and different kinds of beasts and strange things lurking. So they use this notion of ecosystem to describe science communication. And this also appears other places. So this is a paper written by my PhD student, Line Nikolaisen, talking about how scientific knowledge is shaped by the societal, institutional, disciplinary, and so on ecology that it lives within, right? So these ecological notions were quite important, I think, to our work. And so that actually brings us to this notion of terroir finally, because terroir is kind of a term that fits in the ecological metaphors of science communication. And so what is terroir even? You can see there's a glass of wine in the background here, right? Because terroir is a term used to describe agricultural products. So it could be wine, coffee, tea, also cheese can be described using terroir. But basically terroir means the unique interplay of environmental, so the growing conditions perhaps, and human factors, so the winemaker or the coffee grower, and how these environmental and human factors together shape the character of a product, right? So it's especially from the world of wine, right? So we talk about the terroir of a wine, that is the kind of unique set of qualities that describes that wine, and that can be tasted and smelled when you interact, drink that wine, right? And so what's really interesting about this notion of terroir, and maybe also a little bit frustrating, is that scientists have sought to describe terroir in terms of a stable list of determining factors, right? So scientists might say, we know if the soil is chalky, we know if the grape is this varietal, we know if there has been this much precipitation or rainfall that year, the terroir will be this, right? But that's not really possible. So scientists get frustrated by this because it's not really measurable. They say we can't really describe what it is from a scientific point of view, but that's kind of what we love about it, right? And producers of wine, on the other hand, will say it is a real object, but you just can't measure it using your scientific methodology. And that was quite appealing to us because we thought there is something about wine and transferring it. There is something about science communication that might not be describable using kind of technical and quantitative means, but that still characterizes that science communication. Right. So we propose this idea of terroir, this interplay between human and environmental factors as a metaphor for thinking about science communication. And really as an alternative to these ideas, these science communication ideas that try to say this is the best practice, end of story, right? We would say that really depends on the situation that you're in. And so we write about this in the paper, right? Science communication emerges from and is shaped by its own terroir of human and non-human factors. And those could be, and you can add to this list, I'm sure, disciplinary ways of doing, local priorities, institutional cultures, resources, memories of the people involved, right? Individual preferences, expertises, and intuitions, right? So this is not necessarily something we can describe scientifically. And so it really is a challenge to science communication practitioners, but also researchers to move beyond looking for universal solutions, right? We can't just say, if you do this, it'll always work. You will always engage your audience. That we don't believe that that's really a thing, right? There isn't a standardized way of thinking about impact, right? We should instead embrace more relational and situated approaches. So the local, really, as John was mentioning, right? And so we need to recognize how people, places, histories, emotions, and material constraints and affordances play together to create science communication. Right. So just a few perspectives, and then you will get to work on this, which will be much more fun than listening to me talk about it, I'm sure. I just wanted to briefly circle back to science engagement, science communication more generally, just to say that this idea of there not being a gold standard is not something that we came up with. So this is really one of the important works in this area from Massimiliano Bucchi and Brand Trench, and they talk about how there is no a priori defined gold standard for science communication, right? The effectiveness of science communication is always contextual. It always relies on an understanding of the limitations and strengths of different approaches, right? So we're just continuing this idea that they present here and nuancing it perhaps with this idea of terroir as a way to think about limitations and strengths of different approaches and contexts. And then if I can just do a bigger circle back to this idea of sustainability and climate and these problems that we're facing, sustainability science is something that tries to also reject modernity, right? And some of the researchers in this area say that sustainability science can only reject modernity if we stop doing this fatal error, right? We cannot keep excluding other Earth beings as epistemic and ethical equals in our work as sustainability scientists. And so I think we in our group would just end this by arguing that thinking about terroir as a metaphor for thinking about science communication kind of follows that idea also. It's also in a way a rejection of modernity, right? And so using terroir, thinking about all the different actors that are involved in science communication, and maybe not just humans, but also non-human actors, is an important point here, right? And so we need to listen to humans, non-human actors, and other environmental factors as epistemic equals when we think about science communication in order to really address some of these sustainability issues that we're facing. All right, that was a whole lot of talking from me. I'm going to stop sharing now, and we'll have just a moment, and I'll hand over to Sabrina if you are ready.
Totes.
Yes, excellent. All right, and I'll just mute myself.
Yeah, but feel free to jump in anytime, Marianne. And also, if people like in the chat have like questions or anything, you're very welcome. I am not easily interrupted, as one of my students once said. But I would love to hear from you if there's something you think. And by the end of my part of the presentation, we will definitely open the floor up to hear what you're thinking. So my part of this talk is about practicing terroir. And the reason why I have this as my focus is both, of course, because we had to divide this pie somehow, but also because my approach to science communication didn't start in science. To just shortly explain about myself, I both research science communication together with Marianne, but I'm also communicating research and science. And that's how I came into science communication. So if I were even more brilliant, I would be like equal John and Marianne, I guess. That's at least how I would love to see myself. So one hand, I'm now assistant professor in science communication. I have worked with representations in Danish culture before. And next to this PhD that was not in science communication, I have been doing talks and been moderating science-based presentations forever, it seems, more than 10 years already. And it was actually 10 years ago, I made my own science communication company called Rethink. That's Danish for like pure talk or truth or something that's just talk, I would say. So where I do like talks and workshop, communication trainings, books, podcasts, and it's always been based in science and research. So like a huge nerd who loves to share, basically. And that also means I worked in many, many different situations all over the place. So this is just like my ethos slide or showing off slide. These are very different places. Some are like think tanks, NGOs, cultural institutions, big companies, banks, stuff like that, different universities. And by moving through all of these different places of sharing the knowledge that I've been so lucky to get from the university, I can tell you the terroir is real, basically. So when we now talk about practicing terroir, I wanted to translate this a bit because Marianne, she drew like the big picture. Where did this idea come from? Who influenced us? Why do we think this is important? But I want to draw it down on earth, just like the wine growers, right? They have to go out there and make wine every day. So hopefully this can help you get a sense of what terroir can do for you, or maybe what it's already doing for you. So when thinking about how to translate terroir, I was thinking about myself, basically, here represented with a bit of help from an AI, to be completely open and honest. And for me, it starts already in preparing to do, in my case, it would often be a talk or a podcast, something word-based. And working with terroir, I start by thinking about how wine growers cannot make wine alone. There are many voices that needs to be represented. So I might know something about, let's say, sustainability, one of the key issues we are researching, sustainability science. Well, maybe I don't just need the sustainability scientist from the University of Copenhagen where I'm placed. Maybe there's very important indigenous knowledge from the people living in Greenland as a part of Denmark so far, I better say these days. Maybe there are some other perspectives that we really need to draw in here that could actually heighten the knowledge I'm sharing, that could actually make it even more relevant, understandable, more resonant to the people I'm working with, and more truthful also, to be honest, more perspectives to be gathered. So while considering this, I often also think of the people in the room. Like, how can I aim for co-creation rather than just a one-way transmission? And I get this is also based on the media. If you're doing a podcast or an online presentation like I am right now, few of you would appreciate if I just went, hey, Veronica, would you jump in? And I don't know you, Veronica, maybe you would love that. But it's, of course, considering what context you're in. That's part of the terroir. But just opening up and thinking a bit about not just what I could give you, but also what you could give me and how we could make this exchange. So in this case, I'll pose some questions for you to help us reflect on by the end. And I see Veronica is always, I like the idea of non-human actors, and you would also love talking. Perfect. I'll invite you back in a bit. Let me see if I can go back there. So there is this question about aiming outwards, you can almost say. And now I lost my Zoom. There we go. So what came before and what will come after is also something I've kind of learned to think about terroir. And here I don't mean for me, like it wouldn't be what foundation money do I have? How do I follow up with people in the room? It can also be thinking about my audience. What happened just before? Are we meeting here in the morning maybe? Or are we meeting right after you had I got muted. Are we at the zoo where all the kids just want to go out and look at the giraffe? So listening to me is maybe a bit annoying to them where they would otherwise love it. We have to think about time and place, basically. And saying this to you, most of you are probably going to be, well, of course we have to think about this. Because it's kind of important that we know our audiences and we know what's going on around us. But terroir makes this even more present. It's not just something you do with your gut as a science communication practitioner. It has to be part of the whole theory and setup of what we do. And that's what we want to bring into light. A final point of preparing with the terroir is whether, can the setting that you're in, can that be an active participant rather than just a neutral backdrop? So considering the terroir, you don't just grow a grape in any kind of field, right? You have to choose the right grape to grow in that particular field. You have to think about whether earth is chalky. You have to think about whether the ice will come and make it an ice wine, or all these different factors that will change the thing you're doing. And it's the same with the terroir. I could be hired to do the exact same talk in a bank and in a local library. But I will have to present it in different ways. These people are looking for different things. They want to participate in different ways. And the backdrop we're in, whether that be of a welfare state's idea of free knowledge or maybe a capitalist idea of growth, that has to play into the way I present my science. It doesn't have to change it into something that is post-truth or anything like that, but I have to take it into consideration when preparing. That's also part of the terroir. So then we move on to, in my case, it would often be on stage. And even while you are performing, as I call it here, the terroir will be felt. And from those of you who are practitioners, you're probably doing these things already. I don't know how obvious they are to you or if they have become like second nature almost, something that just happens. But this is a place where we definitely feel the terroir as practitioners. So we can ask whether we are adapting to the conditions of the place or we may be trying to override them. That's at least something that, to me, can be quite interesting. Sometimes when you're at a place, you're like, oh, they're very tired. I need to wake them up. Or, oh, they really want to go look at the giraffes. I need to keep them captivated. But maybe it's about riding that wave, or maybe it's about meeting people where they are or understanding the kind of conditions we're in together in this room. And we often do these little adaptations when we do science communication, right? We know, okay, these kids, they seem like they're kind of tired. We have to do something else. Or I can see many people want to talk and are very active in the chat. Maybe I need some more conversation pointers already, so I have to change up my format. We do all these kind of things. And that's part of the terroir. Then we have to ask how participants' bodies and energies react. That's something when we look out, for in my case, it would be looking out across the crowd. How many people are still looking? How many people are looking out the window? How many people are like sitting on needles because they really have to pee? Or, all these little adjustments that we constantly have to take into consideration. And often navigating these, it doesn't come from a theory set, at least not in my experience. It's not because I read chapter 4 of the big SciComm handbook that I know how to adapt to these things. It kind of becomes part of the terroir, like the wine grower who will go out and feel the soil or smell and taste the grape. And he can't really tell you why he wants to water more, but he just notes that would be right, that would be best. Maybe he doesn't have a formula for it, but he's often right, or she. Now, then we can ask how these tension between different perspectives might show up and how they're handled. This is something we have to take in consideration more and more. Because if you open up, if you decide that the people in the room are allowed to co-create, participate, give something back to you as you do your science communication, they're not empty vessels that we need to fill with fuel and science. The more we open up, the more tensions will arise. That's where the anti-vaxxers will explain to you what they actually think is the truth, or people being very critical of 5G. It's also where people who have read a study you haven't read will raise their hand to share. Not necessarily to overrule you or make you seem dumb, but because they want to be part of the conversation and they're excited. There will be tensions in these rooms. If you create good, diverse, inclusive rooms, there will be tension because people of different opinion, different perspective, different experience will show themselves. So just know that if tensions arise in your science communication, if you see these different perspectives bubble up, it's because you're doing your job really, really well. But you have to figure out how to handle it. You have to not be too scared. I grew up here in Denmark, where it's like you have to be, in some ways, very forward. I think a Brit will think directly offensive. But also, you can't really ruin the good mood. Like, we were just having such a good time. Don't ruin it for everyone. And in my terroir here in Denmark, I constantly have to show my audience it's okay. I can handle it. You can disagree. You are not annoyance. You're not a disturbance. We're in this together. And that doesn't mean I'll tell them they're right. It doesn't mean that I agree with the anti-vaxxer necessarily, but it means holding the room somehow, seeing these tension and perspectives, and handling in a respectful way that still keeps the show on the road. Now, finally, while performing, I also want you to reflect on whose perspectives are being centered and who are being sidelined. My PhD was in diversity and inclusion, the more social parts of sustainability. So I am maybe a bit more sensitive to these issues. Not saying I'm always doing it right, but I'm really looking for who are talking here and who are being sidelined. Also, when these tensions bubble up, who am I parking? You're like, oh, thank you for that comment. More questions. That has something to do with the room we're in. It has something to do with me as a science communicator. It has something to do with the topic we're discussing. It has something to do with the political climate. All these things will affect which voices I help amplify in that room and who I try to park. And I'm not saying that because you can't park a voice. Being part of holding the room is you as the facilitator, the communicator. You are the one who makes sure this show stays on the road. So you actually have to make these decisions. If you don't, then it will be, the lions will eat the rest. There will be few people who will dominate the room. And then you didn't allow for these different perspectives to be there. So considering the terroir is also considering tough choices on the job. I cannot always see these things happening until I'm up there. Like, I was out in a local Danish library and was a bit a bit more rural neighborhood than here in Copenhagen, where I'm placed. And I was presenting on the knowledge of races and how the term race doesn't really work biologically, and how it's been considered, and how people have worked with it in different ways, and how do we then consider racism if we don't consider race, blah, blah, blah. And when doing this presentation, after an elderly gentleman stood up, and he said very heartwarmingly, I am so glad that you have taught me that, and he used the N-word, are also humans. I have never considered it this way. And like a third of the room, of course, were completely terrified, because you are talking about me in a very, very, very degrading racist way right now. But that gentleman said, thank you for teaching me something. Thank you for opening me up. Thank you for making me better. He just said it in a terrible way. And for me, I have to both navigate saying, please don't use that slur in here, but also recognizing that he was actually evolving. He was actually learning, right? He was listening to this science. He was listening to these voices and perspectives. How do you hold these rooms? And we are going to need this more and more the more we open up our institutions of science communication, the more we meet people. If the anti-vaxxer is at your event, congratulations, that's amazing. We never meet these people, right? And here they are ready to discuss with you. What do you do? Okay, finally, after this, I am now home. I've sent the bill to the nice people at the library. I'm at home. I'm reflecting. I'm pondering what actually happened. And sometimes this would be in very formal evaluations. Maybe you're lucky enough to be part of a big institution of some sort. Maybe you get monies for a foundation you have to report back. Or sometimes, like me in my small little SciComm company, you just sit alone and take notes about what just happened. And in this reflection, maybe start by saying who ended up shaping the activity in practice. And this can both be the active participants. I know I'm being very human-centered in my approach, but it can also be non-human actors. It can also be stuff about the environment. Copenhagen has been covered in a lot more snow than we usually are, and that alone affects how people enter the room when I'm communicating about climate change, for instance. That it's so cold outside. To some, it's like, oh, but global warming is not happening because it's cold. And for others, it's, oh, look, oh my God, we never had this much snow in my life. What's going on? I'm so scared. That's just because of the weather, which is not climate, by the way, right? But all these things will end up shaping what happens in the room. And I have to take that into consideration, not because I have to think of everything we can't, but I have to be curious. Who or what ended up shaping the activity in practice? Why did it look like it did? Then there's something about rhythms that I find very fruitful to think about. What rhythms did we reinforce and which did we disrupt? And by rhythm of an event, for instance, even just making these babble sounds like old cartoons, was it like a da 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 da, or was it da 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 da? It can be like different rhythms. Who participates? Who speaks? Was it just very fast? Was it very slow staccato? Did I try to play ball and constantly the ball fell down in front of me? I kept inviting. No one took the bite. How does it happen? Did I enter? How did I, as a communicator, buy that? Route? People there. There's something about and how did that experience and the pace and unexpected. Now, with the environment, it can of course be like the snowfall I just discussed, but it can also be what is the context you're in. You can even be in the same building. Like I am both doing teachings here at the University of Copenhagen, but I'm also doing informal meetings. I am also sharing the very same knowledge with the people coming from private industry who are interested in knowing what we're working on. And I'm talking about the same science, presenting the same points. I'm communicating, translating, all of the thing science communicating scientist is supposed to do. But because we will be in different environments, we will be in different contexts, there will be different elements of heating, there will be different actors, human or not, who will play into the conversation, different things to consider. All that plays into what actually happened and the interpretations people are leaving the room with. Then the final question here is, in what ways were I and the participants change? That is something I really try to ask myself. And that's because working with terroir in this way, working with science communication in this way, we are not aiming for transmission anymore. I am not testing, do you now know how many toes a frog has, right? Or when is something considered to be part of CO2 emission scope 2 or 3? That is not necessarily what we're aiming for. That's sort of like cognitive checklist, do you know, sort of knowledge. When moving from that quantitative column that Marianne showed you over to the qualitative and the arts-based, moving from the generalization and onto the resonant, it's about being changed. It's about transformation. So moving from transmission to transformation, what changed? For me, I must admit, I've become very aware that it can be small elements of resonance that sticks with me. Like when we were doing a co-creation session, and we have people participate in them in creative world making. Like they were drawing maps and creating these fantasy worlds based on their real experiences. And one of the participants went up to me and said, "It's so interesting, Sabrina. Like, it's not that I didn't know, but it's like, now I understand." And she tapped her chest. So from her temple to her chest, it is that that transformation. She knew up in her head, she could tap her temple. But by pounding her chest and saying, "I understand," I had a gut reaction to something changed. I don't have words for that. I don't necessarily know exactly what it meant, but it was significant. It was definitely a significant transformation and something I could follow up with that person with thanks to science. Yeah, so I think that's it from me right now. If we have time, I would love to pose a question to people. Is that okay, John? Yeah. Can I just ask you, just in the chat, did any dimension challenge, and that could be in my presentation, Marianne's presentation, did any dimension challenge how you think about good science communication? And you get to decide what good is, right? That is defined by you for today. But it'd be lovely to see your reflections in the chat. And just know we don't care about spelling and grammar and stuff. We're very good at guessing. So do whatever best. And if you're not proficient in English, let's see if Google Translate can help us, right?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Sabrina and Marianne. And I also want to take this moment to thank the University of Leiden, the Science, Communication and Society Department, because from having kind of a guest appointment with them, I can actually use the Zoom function to allow everybody to join. So thank you to Leiden University for that. I see some questions coming in, which is fantastic, and some answers perhaps to Sabrina's question.
Great reflections, right?
Yeah, and please do, like Sabrina, if you look through them and see which ones you'd like to respond to, please do. I don't know if some of them are questions or if they're
Well, for
responses.
instance, I see a Laura Dunford. Sorry about my pronunciation of all your names. I would definitely muck it up. So correct me if it's too bad. But Laura writes, "It's not a challenge, more reassurance that this idea accords with what I have increasingly seen happen in practice in large EU-funded projects." And that's also something that we've been very mindful of. This is not necessarily news to practitioners, right? We might some of these people from the effective side of science communication, the science of science communication, as Marianne presented, we might provoke them, but we often experience practitioners saying, "Well, yeah, duh," kind of. We also see Veronica says that the biggest thing I've learned is that the vibe is so different between kids' lessons in US, UK, NL, South Africa, and in the asylum seeker centers. That's also super interesting, Veronica Allen, it was. Even being in a kids lesson, like you would say, it's the same setup. We have some kids, we have a teacher or a communicator or whatever at the end. What happens? These different cultural settings can change everything and the expectations you meet in there, right? Then Rachel has reflected, "I'm so interested in this idea Marianne mentioned of scientific progress as a promise to mankind for modernity. I'm questioning how science communication can wander with the stasis or the absence of progress can be beneficial too."
Oh, Marianne,
Yeah,
you've
that's
stirred some.
yeah, that's a really lovely question. And so the short answer is I certainly hope so, right? So the idea of thinking about science communication as something that is not sort of mechanistic and technical and only talking about the advantages and advances of science. So if we agree that is something that science communication can do, then I think science communication can also wonder and explore how stasis or the absence of progress or maybe letting things return to natural balances. That is something that science communication can do. But of course, it requires us to stop thinking about science communication according to gold standards, saying, "Oh, we must impart this knowledge and this idea," right? And think about it in a much more kind of meaning making way. So how can we make meaning out of stasis, as you say, Rachel, or the absence of progress? How is that meaningful from a sustainability point of view, from the point of view of the audiences, from our own points of view as science communicators? And how can we kind of promote the meaning making of that in our science communication endeavors? So that's kind of the long answer, I think, to that, and longer answers are, I'm sure, forthcoming, but let's stay with that for now, maybe.
Fantastic. I actually saw a next question from, or a suggestion from Shani, like loving the idea that whoever's in the room, it's all relevant. Everyone's opinions is valid. We shouldn't have set predispositions as to what is a good or bad answer or relationship. But also the part about enjoying the non-linear, messy, hyper-contextual ecosystem approach. And I remember a statement from Jenny Metcalf, and she's done her whole PhD project was about models of science communication. And some of you may know some of the models that she's proposed as well. But she said basically, which I thought was amazing when I saw it, was it all seems like a messy conundrum of practice, research, and theory. And I thought, absolutely, you can look at all the models, you can look at everything you feel you know or understand about science communication, but the reality is it doesn't come together in a neat, orderly fashion. The more you look, the more you find out you're missing. And I really love how terroir kind of embraces all those different options and gives us a way to maybe think about all the different things that can influence it. And so I see some of these questions and some of the comments responded to some of those. So
Yeah.
But it's definitely also important that what we are talking about, it isn't relativism, right? It's not everything is equally good. That's also part of the metaphor that, sorry, some wines are just better than others, right? Or something is, if you say this red wine, I don't know, this, it tastes like, I don't know, what could a white never taste like? I feel like wine reviewers think even like sour wine gums and stuff like that is approachable. But you can definitely be wrong, right? It's not that there is no wrong. It's more that, like when Shani says, love the idea when we have active anti-vaxxers in the room, it's a win. It's more like you created a room where people would engage with science, but evil people who mildly disagree come there to engage, right? It's not to necessarily say, oh yeah, you're right. Oh yes, we all have 5G chips in our necks, I'm sure. Like that's not necessarily the outcome.
I think maybe, yeah, if I could also add to that, because I agree with that very much. A recent study we did of people practicing science communicators who work with art science, we tried to classify their rationales for doing art science communication in terms of standard models of science communication, right? And those models kind of presuppose that when you do science communication, you have one paradigm. You're doing this for one reason and you stick with that, right? The Homo economicus argument, if you will. But what we saw in our data was that these science communicators, who were excellent, by the way, mix and match different approaches and contexts and ways of thinking and doing to fit the circumstances that they were in, right? There is no kind of adherence to a wholly theory or rule of law in the wild and wonderful practice of science communication. It's much more a question of doing, as you say, Shani, sort of nonlinear, messy, hyper-contextual SciComm. Yeah, so that was just a comment I had for that. But we can
And it's
continue.
just, yeah,
Sorry,
it's
go
so
ahead.
great to see Michaela is also writing how this actually prompts to think of alternative formats, right? That when we're not stuck to this old linear modernist way of thinking, suddenly, like I see Michaela is going to invite me to a nice science-inspired musical, right? That sounds amazing, an idea. And how these spaces are going to influence our practice. I love that that's inspiring instead of constricting, because that's really what we want. All these wonderful ways of sharing science, right?
I see an awesome comment from Subaitha, and I
Yeah.
think this is probably one of the things that kind of cut into the whole of evaluation in science communication is that how do you measure some of these things? How do you work out if they work? And it's trying to kind of balance the difference between having set understandable things that you can identify and measure, and then having the more fluid things that aren't really measurable but perhaps felt. Which is often what I experience in science communication is that, you know, it's not necessarily what I can measure or what I can say, it's something more felt by the audience. And within science communication, obviously we're promoting science. So how do we be more scientific about what it is we're doing? That's the eternal question. But I think regarding terroir, she said we love to get to know, so when people recognize science in their own lives, science becomes accessible, but still would love to get to know how can we take this sustainable SciComm practices, which needs attuned methods, and how do we measure its impact to state its relevance of the idea of terroir? So how can we see whether terroir works or not? Is there a way we could measure it? So as a researcher, how do you face challenges to study this method? So great question.
Mm. Yeah, and I think also if I could draw in Leonora's comment right above that many SciCommers have a background in science, so we feel quite comfortable staying with the sort of tried and true methods of tabulating and enumerating and measuring, right? So I think that's a really good point. And I think the response to that and to how we can't maybe use those methods to really understand what's going on in SciComm is a little bit of an annoying response, right? Because what we're in a way saying here is that attunement to the context also requires us to more or less tailor make evaluation methods to the situations we're interested in. Another way to say this could be to say that the proof of the pudding is in the eating, right? So if it does what you want it to do, what you had intended it to do, then it's a success. And then maybe how you got there is less important than whether or to what extent you got there, right? And so we can't just use gold standards to say this was successful SciComm, this was not. We have to really think about what about this situation is it that we're trying to achieve? And are we achieving that given the conditions and constraints we're facing in that situation, right? So rather than having gold standards, winemakers would say, we're not trying to make a wine to taste this specific way every single time. We're trying to get it to express its terroir. So it's maybe an optimization game of saying what is like the optimal way of using all the stuff I have here, all the constraints, all the conditions I have here. How can I optimize that into this really great SciComm situation? And that is then the measure by which we can sort of assess or evaluate that SciComm. I'm looking also at Sabrina a little bit for this. You might have some comments also.
I was just thinking like a metaphor that also stuck with me, sticking in wineland, and we sound kind of alcoholic. I know sticking to this, but one thing I wasn't thinking about is ice wine, which is like a sort of wine where the grapes get a bit of frost and the wine gets very sweet. And if you were to look at that wine and say, "Oh, what a terrible white wine! It's way too sweet," but it's not trying to be a dry white wine, right? It's now something else. We have to go with the flow. We go with the frost, and now it's a dessert wine. I think it's kind of the same thing we have to do with our science communication, right? If you're doing a rap show, don't test if people know exactly how to determine this species of plant after necessarily, right? Maybe it's something else that show can give these people that is just as valuable, maybe even more valuable. But yeah, that's what we have to go with. What was it we were doing? But I think should we move on with I could talk long about this evaluation stuff, so I'll try not to go there.
So
Stick with your great
I've got
answer,
two
Marianne.
comments that I can probably combine. So one was from Giorgio Graffino, and the other was from Octavia Dominguez. And I think both were basically saying, like, so, and one, I like the analogy where that uses it to say a farmer knows the terroir very well, and that's why they can take this or that decision. However, as science communicators, we don't know the terroir until we arrive to the place. And I think this is something that I've heard a lot when I've been around other researchers and they're talking about, we had a discussion with John Besley and Bruce Levenstein, and we were talking about what comes first, the audience or the goal. And I was just stuck in the middle saying, look, from my own reflections, when I go into a room, I might have a goal, but the minute you're in front of people stuck in a situation, you have to adjust, you have to adapt, you have to change. That is the public-facing science communicators' challenge, is that we then have to respond and pivot. And it's not a science, that becomes an art. And I think that's what the terroir really points out, is that the farmer will know that whatever you thought was the way to do it, they'll kind of respond on the fly. And it is slightly a science, but if one doesn't work, they move to the next, and they're very quick at pivoting. And I think science communicators who are out in front of people, we are those farmers. We have to also bear in mind that it is not all the same thing we're doing. Like sometimes you're trying to convince people to take a vaccine. Sometimes you're trying to open up conversations with the public. Sometimes you're trying to bring public opinion towards research. And so science communication is very broad. But I think they will all apply in different ways. But that's the beauty of terroir, right? Is that it depends on the context.
Definitely agree. And that's also why I try to divide in like before, middle, after, because I think most practitioners, when I've talked to them about the terroir, they feel it in the middle of things. That is where they can't always say, oh, it was because the guy on the third row was yawning that I knew it was boring. Like we're not being that specific, but we pick up a vibe, a rhythm. Okay, this is not working. We get that sensation, right? And when you're a good science communicator, like when you're a good wine grower, you refine that sense of what to do. And I know that's annoying. And how do I then get that? You get it by doing it again and again and again and again until we can all eat the pudding, to go back to Marianne's metaphor before.
Yeah, but I think also, if I could add a little bit to that, I think participatory methods or dialogical methods in science communication is a way to get to know your audience on the fly. And I know it can be kind of scary to jump into that. I know that from science education and science communication that is a scary prospect. But once you kind of start practicing just small steps, baby steps at a time, you can gradually become better at understanding who is your audience by just having small bits of interaction with them as you go along. And you can then kind of use that to adapt to who they are. So really using like the full spectrum of ideas for science communication, dialogical and participatory methods, to stay with those models, I think can be a useful way of getting to know your audience and also breaking the ice a little bit, perhaps.
Definitely. Should we maybe also take Robert? Robert has a concrete question for us. Robert Cummings, I think. Can you comment about the connection between terroir and science capital? For example, I like to communicate that my home region is great at radio astronomy and that this is something key about people here, about talent and interest, giving people a compliment that they can feel as locals here. But yet, this connection between terroir and science capital, I would say science capital is part of the terroir, wouldn't you, Marianne?
Yes, yeah, for sure. And this is actually a really nice example of that, Robert, when you mentioned that the people in your region are quite interested in, or who might have a bit of pride in, because it's a big thing where you're from. That is something that is really worth capitalizing on, and I mean that in a positive and constructive sense, right? So that could be one of those icebreakers, giving people a compliment that they can feel as locals here. That's a perfect example, I think, of using science capital, what you know about local science capital, as a brick in your terroir efforts. Yeah.
Okay, and just to let everyone know, we will be going into breakout rooms in a little bit, just to allow everyone to have deeper conversations amongst each other. And importantly, and I think this kind of maybe chimes with, I think, Leonora's Simone's question of how is terroir used when sharing ideas of science communication across countries. It gets especially hard when you're not deep in the culture of your audience. So I'm hoping that within the breakout rooms, you will have a mixture of people from different countries. And I think that is where, because this is a new idea, and so that is where we kind of get the real meat out of it, to really work out how this applies to your own circumstances, what problems or benefits you think it could have, and how this might be different depending on the global context you're in. And so I think that might be a great opportunity to explore that question further. But I think we might maybe have time for just one more brief reflection on one of these questions
We also
before we
had a
go into
question in
breakout
the
rooms.
Q&A, I think, right?
Sorry?
We also have a question in the Q&A, I
Oh,
think.
brilliant. Yeah, great.
Not
I
to
missed
not
that.
to ignore all there are many things in the chat I would also love to discuss.
Oh yeah, do you wanna answer the question in the Q&A, actually? And I think that'd be a
Yeah.
perfect one to go before we go into breakout rooms.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. So a lot of the points you raise in the concept, excuse me, of terroir are very relevant to our work, storytelling, arts-based communication, etc., and exploring science knowledge as a social endeavor. Uh, let's see. I wondered if you could share your perspectives on the relevance possibilities of incorporating such historical perspectives into the concept of terroir in science communication, particularly regarding inclusivity and in hearing voices, perspectives outside of the Western science paradigm. Do you want to start, Mayanne? I know you just wrote a great chapter about some of this stuff.
Yeah, I'll start by saying thank you for this, Stephanie. I think it's so spot on, this idea of historical perspectives. If you think about terroir as a wine phrase, history actually really plays into that as well, because the history of the soil and the weather and the vine that the grapes grow on, the history of those things play into the terroir. So it fits the metaphor really well, I think. And then from a science communication perspective and thinking outside the kind of Western paradigmatic box, I think this also is a really important point. So thinking about attending to the history of science communication for certain groups or of science for certain groups, and using that knowledge about that history, building that into your science communication as part of the terroir, I think would be quite important, right? So I'll see if I can think of some specific examples. I don't know, Sabrina, if you want to add something, maybe I'll just think about specific examples of this if I can, if you can give me a minute to do it.
Yeah, definitely. So I also think that it kind of ties into, I think, Emma Jill or Gill's comment in the chat section about whether this is tied to like practices of engaging minoritized, underrepresented audiences, those inclusion practices that I think definitely both Marianne and I are very influenced by those practices. And we've also done research in those areas. But for me, it's of course an ethical question, also epistemic question, like where do we find truth? But also when engaging these different perspectives, we get closer to the core of something, right? If we engage in indigenous knowledge, if we engage in queer perspectives, not only do we give these communities a voice, but we also get to see, the thing we are studying from many different angles. We get closer to it. We get to understand the earth better, to stay in the metaphor of terroir, right?
Mm.
So it's also about opening those layers up and making people understand we don't do it to be like woke or modern, or it's because they give us more knowledge about the thing we're trying to understand and communicate, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And so I think the chapter that you were referring to, Sabrina, I write about how we can use things like
Exactly.
Afrofuturism or queer theory to think about people who have already, in a sense, survived the end of a world, like the end of the world we're facing right now, right? Thinking about how those kind of discourses and those scholars deal with thinking about the future in ways that are different from modernist perspectives of the future, and using that as a starting point for our science communication. So that's a way of thinking of history and historicity, I think, in SciComm practices that fit that quite well. Yeah.
Okay, now if anyone has any further questions or anything, please feel free to put in the chat. But I'll try and do a quick summary of my thoughts and thank yous in response to this wonderful conversation. So I'll first thank Marianne and Sabrina for their outstanding talk and for their outstanding concept. Remember, again, you can contact them if you'd like to speak to them more about it or share some ideas or questions from your own local context as well, because I think that's what these global meetups are about. It's about sharing your local context and not assuming that anything is kind of universal, which again, why terroir works so well. When I look at terroir, I think about the idea that it's embedded in the place it was created from and all of the different nuances and things that created it. So any science communication approach or activity that is published as a way to do something, we have to acknowledge that that is based and published based on that its own terroir, as we could call it, and that when we export that, that terroir will still be embedded within it. And so we need to recognize that to adapt it. Now, I think most practitioners will just do that anyway. They'll kind of localize it or make it suitable to their context. But it's understanding that that's something that should be done. that we should never take science communication approaches as face value. We need to understand it has a terroir. And also to understand that once it goes into a new place, it will adopt a new terroir that we cannot limit, we cannot control. And that brings me to the idea of evaluation. In evaluation, to have controlled outcomes and to think this is what we want to achieve, well, maybe it's okay to say we generally want to achieve that, but we understand that there's other outcomes that might be beyond our intentions, that might be more relevant to the people and places that we're within. And so I think the concept of terroir is only just beginning. And I think there's so much to be explored here. And I'm really anxious or really excited to see what happens over the next 5 or 10 years with people thinking about this general idea of things aren't so fixed, that there's many different influences they can have, and we have to be open to them. And it can be the weirdest, most wonderful things we never thought of. For example, wine tastes different if you've just had an orange compared to you've had an apple. And so the people in the room, you cannot know, because we don't know if they had an apple or an orange before they went into the room. We just have to be able to be reflective and adjust to them. And again, with the inclusive SciComm mentality of using these different ways of really trying to be open to inclusion of people, but also be aware that we don't have all the answers and that we have to sometimes be very flexible when we're trying to communicate science. So there's so much more I probably could say, but again, I'd like to give a big thank you and a round of applause to Marianne and Sabrina. Thank you and your team for putting this idea of terroir out in the open to us, and helping us to consider science communication in a new way and reimagine what it is we do.
Maybe can I say something about the conversation I overheard, because it was just really fascinating and I loved it. I snuck in and I hung out in the background. But the people I were with talked about how science communication can often be sort of based on the values we have about what is the role of science and what is the role of science communication, rather than any kind of a priori defined models. And I really kind of love that idea that our values are help to determine our science communication. And it feeds back into this notion of modernity, because modernity is also a set of values. It's not really the God-given way that things need to be, right? So we can superimpose our own values on our SciComm to make it effective and just and sustainable, I think. So that was a really interesting conversation. Thanks to that group for that.
I just shared my screen. Sorry, John. If anyone has questions, feedback, comments for me and Marianne, it's a work in progress, and we would love to hear from you, or if we can help with something, we're very open. It's part of the work, right?
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Have a great day or great night. All the best.